Let's jump right into this explainer, because the story of 1492 isn't about some bold visionary taking on a flat Earth myth. No, it's actually the story of how a colossal mathematical mistake sparked the most controversial voyage in human history.
Think about it. What if the most famous voyage in history was, at its core, just a massive accident? Because this wasn't some calculated stroke of navigational genius. The ships that set sail that August were basically put in the water on a foundation of incredibly flawed numbers and, frankly, a catastrophic miscalculation.
You know that old textbook myth, right? The one where Columbus valiantly sets out to prove the Earth was round? Well, we can completely forget that. Scientists and scholars had actually known the globe was a sphere since way back in the 3rd century BCE. The real debate at the time wasn't about the shape of the planet at all. It was about its size. Columbus was relying on ancient Greek, Roman, and Arab scholars to calculate his journey, but ultimately he just did the math entirely wrong.
To really understand the guy who made this monumental error, we have to rewind to the 14th century, over to the powerful Marine Republic of Genoa, Italy. Columbus definitely wasn't born into royalty. He was just the son of a humble wool weaver. But he was completely drawn by the irresistible call of the sea, starting out as a cabin boy when he was literally just 10 years old. By 20, he'd incredibly risen to become a ship's captain. Eventually, he moves to Lisbon, Portugal, and just immerses himself in sea charts, geometry, and map-making. He was deeply ambitious, intensely driven, and honestly obsessed with making a name for himself.
His golden opportunity finally arrives in 1453. Now, for over 1,500 years, the Silk Road had been the absolute economic lifeblood of the Western world. It connected Europe to all those highly coveted silks, porcelain, and spices of the East. But when the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, those vital trade routes were completely severed, cut off. Suddenly, Europe is left absolutely desperate for a new alternative path to Asian markets. While Portuguese explorers were busy trying to sail south, going all the way around the massive continent of Africa to reach Asia, Columbus had this radically different idea. What if you just sailed straight west across the Atlantic Ocean? But here is where he makes his devastating error. In calculating this new route, Columbus incorrectly assumed that longer Arab miles were the exact same length as shorter Roman miles. I mean, it sounds like a simple unit mix-up, right? Like confusing kilometers and miles. But on a global scale, it was a fatal miscalculation.
Because of this massive unit mix-up, Columbus concluded the Atlantic was actually quite narrow. He estimated that the whole trip to Japan and India would be a mere 1,700 miles. But in reality, an entire uncharted continent was sitting right in his path, and the true distance was more than 4 times his estimate. We're talking over 6,800 miles.
Armed with this wildly incorrect math, he takes his pitch to the King of Portugal. But Portugal's advisors were sharp. They rightfully knew his math was fatally flawed, and they rejected him flat out. So Columbus pivots to Spain. Now, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were fresh off a major military campaign, and they were terrified, truly terrified, that Portugal would beat them to the riches of the East. Even though Columbus was making outrageous demands, like wanting 10% of all future profits and the lifelong title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Spain's fear of missing out basically won the day. They financed the voyage.
On August 3rd, 1492, the fleet sets sail into the complete unknown. And once they lose sight of the Canary Islands, you can almost feel the psychological horror setting in. An endless blue horizon, no landmarks, 0 points of reference. By late September, false alarms were literally driving the men crazy. They'd spot flocks of birds or tufts of grass, think land was right there, only to find just more open water. This mounting anxiety rapidly drove the men toward quiet whispers of mutiny by early October. To prevent that mutiny, which, let's be fair, was born out of the crew's very legitimate fear, Columbus does something wildly deceptive. He actually starts keeping 2 separate navigational logs. Seriously, he kept an accurate secret log for himself while showing his anxious crew a completely different public log. This public version systematically underestimated the distance they had traveled, basically tricking the sailors into thinking they were still relatively close to home. But that kind of trickery can only last so long. By the time they hit 2,200 miles, which remember is already way past Columbus's original estimate of 1,700 miles to reach Asia, the situation reaches an absolute boiling point. The men knew something was deeply wrong. Tensions flared right out in the open, and the crew demanded to turn back. They were sailing on a doomed mathematical equation, and they could feel it in their bones. And then comes the dramatic climax. On the night of October 11th, right at 10 o'clock,
Columbus is peering out into the pitch-black darkness of the ocean. He claims he sees a faint, flickering light in the endless distance. He describes it as rising and falling like a wax candle. Now, whether he actually saw it or just desperately needed to see it to stop his crew from turning the ships around, it immediately changed the energy on those decks. To keep his exhausted, terrified men frantically searching that horizon instead of turning on him, he reminds them of this incredibly grand royal reward waiting for the first person to spot land. We're not just talking about historical glory here, we're talking a luxurious silk doublet and an annual income of 10,000 maravedis. The stakes for these sailors literally could not have been higher.
Finally, it happens. At 2 in the morning on October 12th, a sailor aboard the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana looks out into the moonlight, and he screams the exact words that would irrevocably alter global history forever: "Land ahoy!" When daylight finally breaks, the Spaniards step onto the white sands of an island in the modern-day Bahamas. Columbus immediately drops to his knees, thanks God, and hoists the royal standard, claiming the land for the Spanish crown.
That first contact was such a jarring juxtaposition. From behind the dense tropical trees, the native Taíno people watched these strange, heavily armored men arrive. The Taíno, who had lived there for 1,000 years, generously greeted these exhausted travelers. They offered gifts, parrots, cotton, food. In stark contrast, the Spanish handed over mere trinkets, like red caps and little glass beads. It was truly a meeting of two entirely isolated halves of the planet. Now, because of that monumental mathematical error we talked about, Columbus completely missed the fact that an uncharted continent was standing right in his way. He firmly believed he had successfully navigated to the East Indies, exactly as his flawed math had predicted. So, he confidently called the native Taíno people he encountered Indians. And that's a lasting, highly inaccurate naming convention born entirely out of a bad navigational miscalculation.
The immediate aftermath unfolds pretty rapidly. Columbus spends the next 2 months searching the islands for gold, builds a makeshift fort, and then makes this triumphant return to the Spanish crown. To prove he was successful, he brings back spices, exotic birds, and, tragically, kidnapped natives. This perceived success gives him the total momentum he needs to launch 3 more voyages across the ocean, eventually reaching the South American mainland.
But we have to look at the dark legacy of these voyages and the devastating impact they had. The settlements Columbus founded introduced forced labor and brought over deadly European diseases to populations that had absolutely zero immunity. As a direct result of this contact, the Taíno population was nearly wiped out entirely in just a few short decades.
The irony of Columbus's final years is honestly staggering. Even though he irrevocably changed the world, he rapidly fell out of favor with the Spanish court during his own lifetime. At one point, he was even arrested for his mismanagement of the colonies. He ends up dying in 1506 in disgrace. And to his very last breath, he was stubbornly blind to the reality of the massive continent he had stumbled upon. He died still believing he had found a new route to Asia.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a really heavy reality. Columbus's journey west was undeniably built on a massive mathematical mistake, yet it ended up connecting two completely isolated halves of the planet. So how do we weigh an accidental discovery against its devastating human cost? It was a single fatal miscalculation that ended the world as it was known and violently birthed the one we live in today.